Welcome everybody who's joining us from all corners of the United States so far. For those of you who don't know me, my name is James Shomar. I wear a lot of different hats, and coming to you today as the Chief Growth Officer for MACNY, the Manufacturers Association here in Central New York, upstate. And my background is primarily through startups and venture capital, which is where I originally met Martin. And my role at MACNY now, supporting member companies in growth of their organization, be it new venture creation, so launching new products or entering new markets, and coaching through that strategy, as well as growth of core business, from helping people accelerate direct sales models and processes to even helping people be more efficient with their their distributors or reseller networks as well. So I'll, I like to practice give first sort of philosophy, which is something we'll talk about. So if any of that is something that I can help you with, or you're looking for connections or just looking to connect, I'm going to put my email address in the chat, and please feel free to reach out to me. Would love to connect. So there's my email. So a little bit of logistics on this. I think there is a Q&A window still, is there? No, we just have the chat. All right, so most of this will be myself interviewing Martin, asking some direct questions, but we want to leave a lot of time for audience Q&A. Find the most efficient way to really do that is through the chat. So at any time you have a question, please put it into the chat, and then when comes time for Q&A, I'm basically just going to kind of read them off in the order that they came in to have Martin answer them.
James, can I interrupt for 2 seconds? I just want to acknowledge that the president of Lemoyne has just joined this event. So Martin, I thought you'd like to know that.
Well, hello there, Dr. Lemura. Good to see you. Lemoyne has been such a partner for all the things that we've been doing across upstate New York, and a beacon of leadership, and I appreciate it. Good to see you.
The pleasure is all ours. It takes two to tango, so to speak, and we're so happy to be working with you. And the opportunities are boundless when you have, good faith and goodwill among the partners. So for that, I thank you.
Absolutely. Well, good to see you as well, Linda. Thank you for joining. Good to be here. So I was, to introduce Martin. Truthfully, Martin, I was trying to put together a bio for you and quickly realized I could not put one together that would at all do it justice based on all of the things that you're involved in. Could literally spend the entire hour just listing off the accomplishments and initiatives. So I kind of created a condensed version that I thought would be relevant for us here. So I've known Martin for a number of years now. We kind of obviously promoted him as the founder of TriNet. He was serving as the CEO from 1988 to 2008, if I'm correct, and chairman again until 2010. Martin's been heavily involved in a lot of issues in, all breadth of things, but in the main focus of startup community building and helping people realize their full potential through the Up Mobility Foundation, which supports a lot of great initiatives. He's also the founder of Upstate Venture Connect, which has been helping build startup community across upstate New York, entrepreneurs across borders, and just a huge host of different initiatives helping people through that mission. Recently chronicled a lot of his things in a book called More Good Jobs, which I'm going to promote for him, even though he did not ask me to do so. And I'll include a link, to that in the chat if any of you want to check out that book.
I beat you to the punch, and so I did include the link to More Good Jobs in the book. Oh,
I see that. Okay. Well, I got the huge Amazon link right there, so you can get direct. This was a great, I found it a really interesting read, not just kind of chronicling some of the things we talked about, but as sort of a how-to guide in startup community building. Again, speaking personally now, I've known Martin for a while and respect him not just as a successful entrepreneur and business person, but chief among which is a community leader. his heart's really in this, and he's in it for all the right reasons. And I say that, with a total straight face. It was why I was really honored when he reached out and said, he wanted to build a community alongside that book that, we call the More Good Jobs community. And it's been great to see how that's sort of flourished now into a community of startup community builders. Internationally, actually, we have folks from across the country and internationally. These are people who, much like Martin, are oftentimes entrepreneurs, but everyday people as well, who really help entrepreneurs in their community start companies and really have impact. And so it's been great to form that community. And if any of you are kind of interested in some of the things we're talking about today, want to support entrepreneurs in your community, I'll also include a link to check out the More Good Jobs community and connect with others who are doing the same all over the place. So definitely encourage you to do that. So with our intros over and plugs, I'm gonna dive into some questions. So it's funny, Martin, we were trying to find a way that you could be in Little Falls, but you're out in San Francisco Bay Area today, which is interesting, because I think it kind of provides an interesting segue to say, how did you end up there? Like, tell us about your upbringing in Little Falls. Tell us about your career before TriNet. How'd you end up in that region?
Well, Little Falls, which is just east of Utica, a second smallest incorporated city in the state of New York, population 5,000, is where I grew up. Went to high school, went to local community college, and went to Shippensburg University. And after that, the job that I had out of college was working for Navy Exchanges, which operates the post exchange for the US Navy, and really had the good fortune to work around the East Coast, West Coast, Pacific, Europe. And my last assignment with Navy Exchanges landed me in the Bay Area. And by the time I got there, I'd been at organization for 11 years and I was unemployable. So like a lot of people that start companies when you're not employable, because in my case, I had the label stamped on my forehead of being good for government use only. And I had to look around and really couldn't find anything that made any sense for me to work at. But started on this path of looking at business opportunities in HR, since my background with Navy Exchanges was entirely in the field of human resources. And so I stumbled across at a national HR conference, happened to stumble across the very nascent industry of what today we call professional employer organizations. And so for me, starting TriNet was something that identified with the career I was really committed to and wanting to have an impact on the workplace, and the idea of helping smaller companies do that. And again, it's kind of ancient history to go back to the late 1980s, but the world was very different with regards to the workplace then. And that most of the people that were graduating from colleges wouldn't think of really working for a smaller business, because the best pay, the best benefits, the best opportunities were really with larger companies. But I believe that was going to change. And that was in part due to what I would look at as the changing regulatory environment, the advent of technology. I had already had some experience in human resource information systems, so I knew a lot about kind of software and the idea of how software could make a difference in the workplace. And different things that just led me to believe small business would actually start creating more opportunities. And as TriNet began, we really concentrated right here in the Bay Area with the emerging growth technology segment as the customer base to focus on. And that really was a life-changing thing for me, because that forced me to learn what happens with early stage technology companies. How do they go about the process of even raising money, much less developing a product and getting it to market? And especially when the assets of that kind of business walk out the door every night. It was very different compared to now we kind of accept that as a given for, there's been a lot of change in the last 33 years. But it was, we were sledding in some tough areas to kind of be out in front as much as we were. So that's what led me to that path of starting TriNet.
You know, I've often heard you say in those early days of founding the company that you started out expecting kind of to be a small business person, and then found TriNet was really more of an innovation economy company, to use the phrase you coined. Tell us about that.
Yeah, thanks for reminding me of that. I kind of overlooked that, and you're absolutely right. When I began, it was with the idea of just having a small business. And it took me being in the business for about 1.5 years before I began to understand the business model was very dependent on scale. And it was either go big or go home. That's element number one. And so we had to sell to a national or global audience. And also the very nature of what we were doing, because it had never been heard of before, the idea of taking a bunch of small businesses, putting them into one group, kind of aggregating everybody under one payroll and tax ID number, and using the scale of that larger group to purchase benefits and manage risk and do all the things that a professional employer organization does today. Back in the late 80s, early 90s, it was pretty unheard of. And so it was an innovation. And those are the two things, those elements of, if your business is based on an innovation that is not yet accepted in the marketplace, and if you're really aiming towards that national or potentially global audience, and so you're building a company on the premise of those two things, that's what separates a small business from a startup. So I started as a small business, but really we were a startup and I just didn't know it. It took like 2 years of basically realizing that, this isn't going to work as a small business. And it was because we made that decision to go after the vertical market of emerging technology companies that I then began to understand a lot of these elements of how startups work.
I find that what I found interesting about that definition, because a lot of times people will sort of bucket that group of high growth companies into tech companies, is that, TriNet's not the traditional tech company you would think about as like a social media site or a SaaS product or anything like that, but yet fits that sort of scale characteristic. And so I wonder, for a lot of the people listening who have probably never heard of an innovation economy company, let alone thought of themselves as one, what would be your advice to them about how to leverage that same sort of insight? How should they be shifting their perspective, basically?
Well, I can tell you where I was so lucky in that here I was thinking I was a small business, but then made this transition to being a startup. And I happened to be in the most entrepreneur-friendly and community supportive place on the planet to do that. And as I write about in the book, if I had tried to start trying it any place else with what I knew back then and what it is we were trying to do, I would have failed for sure. Absolutely, no doubt. And so the guidance that I would give for someone that thinks, hey, I'm really working on an innovation economy company, no matter where I am, upstate New York or Alaska or whatever, the idea is that for me that made such a difference was that I plugged in to the networks of where other people who were doing startups were hanging out. And it's what I learned from working with other people who had been there and done that, and people who really gave a lot before I even got to know them. So what I mean by that is there's a big difference culturally between places like Silicon Valley, where there's a very active startup community, and now several other places where there is a lot of growth in these companies. Culturally, the thing that makes it work is there are a lot of people that will give of themselves to help others, including entrepreneurs, before trust in a relationship has been earned. And I was a beneficiary of that in many ways. I'd walk into a networking event with other startup entrepreneurs and very seasoned entrepreneurs and investors and service providers. There'd be different kinds of meetings that were very open and accessible. of which even today, there are a lot of places in upstate New York and other places that close off their meetings to only their defined constituency. And even back in the early 90s in the Bay Area, it's like, well, they promote the visibility of the events to everybody and try to get anybody in there. You didn't have to be a member of some group in order to attend most of these events. And then show up, and I'd run into somebody and kind of be pitching, well, here's what TriNet does. And the person would say, well, you know, I don't really need that. I'm not really growing a business that can take advantage of it, but let me introduce you to Bob over here. And they would walk over and introduce me to somebody. And I had just met the person who's now doing the introduction a few minutes ago. So culturally, that's a big deal, to be in a supportive place where people are actually giving first before trust has been earned. And this was a very important lesson. So the guidance to those that are starting companies, especially that are based on an innovation and have ambition to grow it to a national or global audience, hanging out with others that have been there and done that, and finding communities of supporting people that kind of live by those rules, that can make a huge difference.
It's interesting you tell that, because at least the impression I'm getting is it's not just, peers, so to speak. It's not like you were just having access to other small business owners or other burgeoning entrepreneurs. It seems more like people you would think of as being inaccessible, bigger VCs and entrepreneurs were in the room with you, like just
Yes.
there. Tell us about that sort of dynamic and culture of that, sort of tiered aspect specifically.
Yes, yeah, because that's another point, that sometimes those that are most notable and have the greatest reputations, and we perceive these people are hard to get to, even in Silicon Valley today, a lot of those people end up going to events, and you can actually walk up to them and talk to them. All right. And lo and behold, they're not necessarily going to invest on the spot, but they're not necessarily going to shut you down either. So, that accessibility factor is done with a certain amount of modeling in regards to, in Silicon Valley, I'll say, if you exit a company, and you could have a huge win, all right, with, it's not unusual to see people selling a company that maybe is not a major brand name and that you wouldn't recognize as a consumer, but they could be selling a company for $100 or $500 million or whatever, and they could be on the beach as an entrepreneur. As a result of that, the culture in Silicon Valley is, if you're not out there helping the next generation of entrepreneurs, you're not very cool. If you want to be on the in crowd in Silicon Valley, after you exit your company, you're turning right around and doing what you can to be helping other entrepreneurs. That's where you really get street cred in a place like Silicon Valley. And so that ethos spills over in terms of even being accessible to people. Obviously getting referrals so that when you're trying to reach someone who is hard to get, you may not always be so lucky to have a creative collision at a networking event. But for those people that you do meet in a creative collision at a networking event, keep track of enough of those, and sooner or later, some of those people are going to introduce you to that person that you're trying to reach, who is harder to get to. And again, that is part of the spirit of giving first, and what makes, it's really, in my opinion, the secret sauce that makes Silicon Valley work. And I had to leave Silicon Valley and really look at that with a lot of reflection in the rearview mirror for me to fully appreciate that.
It's interesting. I recall this a couple of years ago now, following on Twitter. I'm blanking on his name, but he was the founder of Product Hunt, if you remember that website, and he sold it to Angels List. And I remember very vividly. Before he had even sold the used furniture, he was an entrepreneur, bootstrap. Before he had sold his used furniture and bought a house, he had launched a seed fund and started reinvesting in other people. I just thought that was such an interesting contrast to someone who might, sell their company, move to Florida. or something like that, you know?
Which unfortunately we have far too much of in upstate New York and some other places that have not yet got a built out community, but we're starting to see that change.
Yeah,
right.
for sure. So getting back into that 90s era, tell us about that first growth phase you experienced during the dot-com era, your move back to Little Falls, and the ultimate bubble bursting.
Yeah, the TriNet side throughout the dot-com era, going into the dot-com era, which remember dot-com begins as Netscape went public in 1995. We had already built a reputation, had a following, and we're getting serious growth in emerging tech. Now dot-com comes, changes everything. And we got at least a few people here on this call that kind of worked through that era. I know that certainly I met Roger back in those days. And we all know that there was so much stuff happening in the, call it 95 to 2000 era, even at TriNet. It was a great place to work at TriNet if you were in sales. It was great, all right? Because like we were writing deals, we were closing business over the phone, and in our kind of business, that's unheard of. And yet if you were working at TriNet in the operations or delivery side, you were drowning. So it was a demand-driven environment. It was really incredible. But as we were riding that wave of growth through the dot-com era, we attempted to take TriNet public in the year 2000. So we were lining up to go public in the year 2000 when 99% of our business was coming from dot-com customers. Filed to go public on March 2nd, 2000. And lo and behold, things didn't quite work out and what the dot-com era IPO rhythm was. And along the way, and just before we filed to go public, we moved our family from Silicon Valley, where we started the company and grew it from 88 to 99. In 99, moved the family late 99 to my hometown of upstate New York, Little Falls. And the idea was I was going to commute for about a year and a half or so and take the company public and then hand the reins over so I could step out of an operating role. Didn't quite work out because we were not successful in going public. We went through the entire process right up to pricing day. And so I can really say I'm one of the few people you may speak with that has been through the entire IPO process right to pricing day twice with the same company. All right, so we were not successful. And then as rapidly as we had grown up to that point, we were now working in reverse and we were shedding our team, and there was a lot of pain. On my blog at babinec.com, I have several posts that relate to wartime leadership, because at the beginning of COVID, we had a lot of challenge for all companies and right-sizing their business and getting through difficult times. And so some of my experience there is in that wartime leadership series on my blog. But it eventually righted the ship, and we continued to grow while I was commuting for 10 years from Little Falls to Silicon Valley. And anybody that's traveled from upstate to the West Coast knows there's no direct flight. So not a lot of fun, but got it done, and very fortunate that everything worked out from a family perspective, and kids have done well. And Chris and I just celebrated our 41st anniversary. So all well on the home front. And I continue to be on TriNet's board all these years later.
Wow. Yeah, it's amazing. And I recall from stories you mentioned, but also I think you mentioned it in the book, was those flights feeling like this total culture shock and transformation coming from upstate to Silicon Valley. You mentioned a little bit about the culture, but I wonder if you can just sort of illustrate how stark a difference that was for you.
Yeah, of course, in Silicon Valley, it was from a business perspective and those things that are related to innovations and growing companies based on innovation. We were in a land of plenty in Silicon Valley. And then in upstate New York, it was a land of scarcity. And there was just this belief that it can't be done here. So I'd be running around talking to people, and everyone kept saying, we can't really do this in upstate New York. That's the kind of things that we're talking about, and having people create emerging tech companies that can only be done in places like Silicon Valley or Boston or New York City. We can't do that. We can't. I just heard that so many times. It started to bother me. All right. Because I didn't believe that. And it's also that belief that, as our research showed that we did for the book, if your city isn't growing, it's dying, because there's a bifurcation between the cities that are actually attracting talent and retaining talent versus too many cities that lose their talent. Across upstate New York, we have the distinction of having more than 100 colleges that collectively enroll 500,000 college students. We have I want to say like the third largest amount of R&D as a region, corporate and academic research of almost $3 billion a year, just in upstate New York. We're not talking New York State, just upstate. And you have a very strong base of STEM programs and engineering talent, and a prior generation of companies like IBM, GE, Carrier, Kodak, Xerox. You could go on and on with companies that got started in upstate New York and still had some presence of engineering talent. Close proximity to the capital markets in New York City, as many of our best and brightest talent migrated to New York City. And so there were a lot of personal and institutional ties between upstate and New York City. And in my view, those elements in terms of talent and capital and the density of people that had skills that were necessary, along with quality infrastructure, all of those things are the elements necessary to really grow a lot of innovation economy companies. So it just bothered the heck out of me that here we have all the assets. And when we began this journey in 2010, upstate New York was ranked dead last, number 19 of the 19 regions being tracked for venture capital. And the 4-state region of Kansas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and Arkansas actually had more venture capital invested in that region than we had in upstate New York. And for me, there was something wrong with that picture. So the 10 years that I spent commuting, I just spent a lot of time thinking about what's wrong with this picture. And I'm only one guy, but someday when I have a little bit more time, if there were some resources at it, what can I do? And that's the mission that I've been on since 2010.
Wow. So tell us about the founding of UVC and how that came about.
So the origins for Upstate Venture Connect began with my spending a lot of time going to various groups around upstate New York where startups were gathering. And I would just put a lot of miles on my car and I would drive to Buffalo. I'd go to Rochester, I'd go to Syracuse, I'd go to Albany. I mean, these places are up to 200 miles away. And I'd just be going all over upstate, wherever I could find out some meeting where people were hanging out as things related to emerging tech and innovation economy. I would put it on my schedule and go, and just started meeting a lot of people. And when I started asking about, well, who else is interested in trying to make a change, I didn't get a lot of warm reception right away. And then when I actually started to say, I'm thinking about starting a nonprofit to help do this, I got a lot of pushback, and people say, we already got enough nonprofits. The last thing we need in upstate New York is another nonprofit. All right. Again, you can't do this type thing. But my good fortune was that eventually I came across my partner for Upstate Venture Connect, the CEO, Nasser Ali, who at the time was running the Syracuse Tech Garden, which was upstate New York's most successful incubator and kind of facility that actually was a nexus point for emerging tech. And he and I had similar views, a shared passion for this. And the two of us have remained partners ever since in working to address this, and have slowly built a team that included developing relationships in all of the upstate New York metro markets, and finding people who shared that passion, some of which are on this session today that I had called out earlier. And instead of our concentrating on building relationships with organizations, which is when we first opened the doors for Upstate Venture Connect in 2010, that's what we did. It didn't work so well, even though I could get access to government leaders, college presidents, people that were running companies, major companies. I could get access all over the place. But even when they showed an interest in the idea of what can we do, what can our organization do to support the building of a startup community, the leader of some of these organizations would express that interest. When it came down to it, I found there was a big gap between what the leader might have said they were interested in and what actually got delivered by the people that would do the work. So we weren't making much progress. And we shifted our thinking and started to concentrate on who are the people that are the doers. And in the book, chapter 6, we talk about high impact persons that really are the doers, and then really put our energy towards building a community of doers, people that were actually doing stuff and by their actions demonstrated that they were the right ones to develop and help partner with us to create this cultural change of how can we get others to think about the importance of giving first, as an example, before trust is earned. How can we get people who are seasoned entrepreneurs, maybe in businesses which are not necessarily innovation economy businesses, or people who might have financial capacity and are interested in helping their community, but they tell themselves, well, I really don't understand much about emerging tech. So, I can't really get involved in this startup stuff because, among other things, my financial advisor says investing money in an illiquid private company is the dumbest thing I could do with my money. All right. So, we took those challenges one at a time and tried to get people that really had that community orientation and really had skills and relationships that could help companies to get them off the sidelines and into the game. And we looked at it, and still do today, as a journey. We're never going to arrive at a stage where we say, hey, we got this. All right. It's going to, we're never going to be a Silicon Valley in Upstate New York, but we have made a lot of progress in the last 11 years. And that progress is slowly starting to produce companies and exits and people who are now with success from building a company and exiting are turning around and doing that very thing that I said earlier that happens in Silicon Valley. They're investing in the next generation of entrepreneurs. So we keep this momentum building. It's rinse and repeat. Over time, this will work. And we're already starting to see some evidence of that.
It's interesting you say that, because I've seen some of that. I'm wondering, first part of the question is if you can talk about some of the successes you've seen, in the startup community across Upstate. But the second part of that is, and why I was excited to have this conversation in this forum, is that impact hasn't been as strong in kind of the more established business community, who still is sort of not as hasn't adopted the same sort of culture quite as much. And so I was wondering if you can comment about how some folks, in the more established community, running small businesses and stuff like that, can start to get involved, can figure out how to kind of wrap their mind around give first and that sort of thing too. So
when I think of the traditional business mindset across Upstate New York, where people running successful companies, the companies are growing, they're profitable, throwing off lots of cash. And there are a number of them. We got some really good entrepreneurs, some really good businesses, but it's not unusual for us to find someone fitting that profile who doesn't want to have the people on their team get exposure to audiences where maybe they get poached, all right, and get hired by someone else. And so it's not uncommon for them to say, hey, I want to be protective, keep my team shielded, keep them focused on their work, and overlook the benefits that people on their team would have if they were interacting with a broader audience and maybe got exposed to some ideas that they weren't seeing inside their own company. And is there a risk that people might find other opportunities? Sure, there's some of that risk, but the value of the injection of new ideas to whatever the business is, I would argue, can offset that. And in Silicon Valley, I can tell you, the intensity of the competition for the best talent is greater here than maybe any place else. And if you're a web developer, or you certain, especially certain things in the software development area, are in such great demand, and across the board, not even in just the most in demand, but across the board, the competition for good talent is so intense. It puts a huge amount of pressure on the company to be constantly thinking of, how are we going to be the employer that people want to work for? And that's a good thing. And I talk about that in the book. I go into some depth, because remember, my background as a professional employer is to help companies attract and retain top talent. So that whole notion of, you got to think about, it's in your best interest to be the best employer. And that includes giving visibility to things outside your company, as your talent on your team will appreciate that. So yes, there are far too many examples of people thinking parochially versus that broader picture of, hey, if I want this company to be successful, we have to be nimble. We have to be adapting to changing times. And it's hard really to be on the top of changes that are happening in the world around you if you got too many of your people sitting inside a company's silo. It's kind of my view.
Sure. That's interesting. So that's sort of one area, or one answer, I guess I could say, to my next question, referring to that sort of give first mindset. So, it's clear, and we didn't really touch upon the referral network you built through TriNet, but it's clear, how you benefited on the receiving end of that give first. But I'm curious if you can speak to the benefits of being on the giving side as well, and why that active participation in that is of direct value to somebody.
Sure. Maybe I can even give an illustration here of, this is what a success looks like. One of the initiatives that we started in Upstate Venture Connect, we began an accelerator program based on the model pioneered by Techstars. That accelerator program is called StartFast Venture Accelerator, where we bring in a cohort of startups, between 5 and 12 startups every summer, and surround them with a lot of mentors who volunteered. These are not paid mentors, but we would surround these garage level startups who were not ready to even receive a small amount of capital. We're talking very early stage. And then work with them to develop their idea, give them the right coaching so that they could expand their business. And at the end of a 12-week program, be qualified to then pitch to a group of investors that we would assemble. And so we operated that program for 8 years, and it just learned a lot and built a network of a lot of mentors who then got engaged in helping these early stage companies. And some of them were seasoned emerging tech people, but a lot of them were just seasoned business people and had skills that would help in various things. Now, Lemoyne College was a very important partner for this, since we also were hosted at Lemoyne College and used their facilities and their team, and it was a huge asset for building this particular program. So one example of how someone would benefit from participating, even as a mentor, we'll use as a company that went through this program, a company called SpinCar, which some in the audience may recognize today as one of Syracuse, New York's hottest emerging tech companies. But that company began in the accelerator program as just an idea. And they had a technology that was using a camera and some software special kind of camera, taking pictures of things they thought they would sell in the fashion industry. And it didn't get too far, even over the course of the program. But one of the mentors that we introduced them to, John Max Miller, went ahead and took it upon himself. His background was in the auto industry, in the auto dealer industry, and he really knew a lot about auto dealers. And he said, you know, this technology that SpinCar has is perfect for helping auto dealers sell used cars. And so when he first pitched that to the team, it was not called SpinCar at that time, it was Swipe to Spin, you know, they weren't really warm at it. He didn't give up. And he kept on saying, let me introduce you to some dealers and let's talk about this. And eventually, through his efforts, they did a complete pivot and said, this is what we want to do with the company. We can see there's some reason to go down this path. John Max Miller learned a lot by going through that process, helped this company grow, is a board member of the company, became a shareholder, not only as an investor, but picked up a lot of options. And while his initial desires to help the company was really just based on, I can help these guys. I can see as an experienced auto dealer entrepreneur, they have a product that can work in an industry that I know. That was his motivation. It ended up being a huge win for him and a lot of other people. The company employs now, I think, 350 people between New York City and Syracuse, but the base of operations is mostly Syracuse. I mean, that's a success story. And investors made a lot of money. I'm still an investor, but a lot of people have taken chips off the table on that. And it's an example of how people getting involved don't know what the outcome is necessarily going to be, but they do it because they have the skills that can make a difference in helping this company go to the next level, and they want to do it for that reason.
So I'll just got one more question before we open up to audience. And so just a reminder to put your questions in the chat for Martin. We'll get to that in a second. My last question is, you know, what I find quite actually empowering about this perspective is that, you know, traditionally in regions like ours, we tend to divert much of both the blame and the control, I'd say, to government, be it taxes or regulations or whatever, but also economic development programs to try and turn things around. And what I think this sort of suggests is that the power really lies in the hands of the community. And I wonder if, well, you agree with that, but if you can just speak to that topic.
Well, it's hard because now I could spend another hour talking about the political side, because, you know, that's another set of things I get involved with. And yes, I am a believer the power does reside in the community. But depending on where the community is and the ethos of that community, it can be really hard to unlock, really difficult. Across upstate New York, another observation that I would have is we have a docile population that is waiting for the state to do things. And that always kind of bothered me. It's like, why are we waiting, right? It's like, the answer is not for the state to do it. We have the power within the community. We just need to bring people together and try to get them aligned behind a vision. And, I continue to do that on even on the political side through our organization, Unite New York, which you would see at uniteny.org. Nonpartisan, I would point out. But that's another thing. Whenever you start talking about change and government has an influence on what happens, the political side gets in the way. And so navigating around that is not so easy. So I'm not discouraged by those things. I tend to look at that as, well, that's just another challenge to take on. And where can I find some like-minded people who would share my passion for something like that? And, leaders, as we talk about in the last chapter, I think, of More Good Jobs, change comes when leaders can start to build a little bit of a following with people that share in the change that the leader's trying to help bring about. So any of us can build community. It's not just community for startups, but if we're trying to bring about change in our community, there's a lot of people that are probably ready to join you in any change that you want to try to bring about. And then the challenge is, well, how do you find them? And how can you get them to join you in the journey of bringing about the change that you are trying to bring about? So, I mean, I actually have a lot of fun doing this stuff. I'm retired in one sense. I mean, not on anybody's payroll, but, you know, I have a lot of fun bringing about that change and working with people that I really enjoy working with who share passion for the kind of crazy ideas and stuff that I decide to go after. And I'll also say that when it comes to the emerging tech side, a message that I'm constantly bringing up to those in traditional industries and people who are very successful, but in things other than emerging tech, encouraging them to become investors through seed funds, like across upstate New York, UBC, we've helped create 6 different seed capital funds and put these investors together in one group. And when you start paying attention to what goes on in this world of emerging tech, because you have some dollars that are at stake, and the seed capital investing side will really make that possible. That's in chapter 7 of the book. The takeaway is this stuff will really keep you young, all right? Because in order to make good decisions about what companies to invest in and what are the challenges that those companies have and how can you help them, as we say in the startup investing world, the easy part is writing the check. The hard part is helping the companies be successful. So this stuff really does require some active engagement in things that are very contemporary. And for me anyway, I still have fun introducing certain things about technology to my kids who are in their early 30s. All right, so I'm bringing stuff to them, and I'll try to keep doing that as long as my breath can fog a mirror.
That's a good segue into our first audience question from Michael Kosan. Good to see you, Michael. He was a co-investor with us at StartFast in Lot Monkey, if you remember that a few years ago.
Yes, indeed.
Capital region. And seems like he just raised a new seed stage fund. Congratulations. Asking specifically what local startups should be on his radar that can compete with the best. If you want to give a shout out to any local teams, that is.
Well, there are so many local teams, and when we say local, are we talking just Syracuse, or we got TCG Player, we got Plows and Mows, obviously has Spin Car. We go, obviously Upstate's most tremendous success in 2021 was the IPO of ACV Auctions, which went from 0 to a $5 billion public company market cap in 7 years. I mean, we've got all kinds of successes that are now part of what is making upstate New York a place that is beginning to retain the talent that is graduating from our universities instead of waving goodbye to it. But this is the journey.
Another great segue into Mike Doretida's question. So Mike says, given the number of higher ed institutions and wealth of young talent at these institutions, what role can these institutions play in helping to both foster and promote more prosperity in their own backyards? What could they do differently to help accelerate the progress made thus far?
Well, as Mike is familiar, I do have a whole chapter on education in Mortgage Jobs. I think it's chapter 9. And part of what I talk about there is that educational institutions, not Lemoyne, by the way, but other educational institutions typically will fall into an island mentality of putting all their emphasis on their efforts towards students, alums, and faculty without really having much thought to active engagement in the local community beyond those 3 constituencies. That's the biggest thing. And then of course there's how tech transfer works for those universities that actually have the research function going on, and not all universities fall into that category. But how tech transfer works, there's a lot of different ways. In the book, we talk about good examples and examples of things that in upstate New York were not so good. It actually thwarted the opportunities for development of technology that would create jobs and engage students and who would want to be involved. But universities in general are tremendous, tremendous resources for their community, not only because they employ people, but they are that opportunity to bring talent into the community, and talent is coming from usually areas outside of the community. So we are, Mike Doretta would call the opportunity for it to be a fountain of youth, as we're constantly renewing talent. And for us, in my view, that with more than 100 colleges and 500,000 college students across upstate New York, it's our greatest single asset. So being able to engage students with the local community so that they actually have relationships with the local community, that's really the key. Because the more relationships that students create with people that are locally, that are able to appreciate what the student can do, and the students can see, hey, these are people that are going to help me. Why did SpinCar remain in Syracuse? Because there were local people helping SpinCar grow, and those resources were strong enough, those relationships were strong enough that the company decided to remain there instead of moving someplace else. All right. And that's what we want to be doing, is that a combination of experiential learning. So it's not just lectures and tests, but people learn entrepreneurship not through lectures and tests and papers. They learn by doing. So we have that, and the more that they do that involves engagement in the community, the deeper those relationships will become, and we will increase talent retention that's going through these universities.
Well, let me ask a follow-up question to that along those same lines. So if you think about the community of students as a group of potential founders, what are your thoughts? I mean, do you believe that they have the capacity to really compete on the world stage in creating the next generation of innovation economy companies?
Absolutely. There's no question. Every company that gets started, companies don't get started because of the government. Companies get started because an entrepreneur or a combination of entrepreneurs as co-founders have an idea and bring it to market. When did Facebook get started? When did Dell Computer get started? When did Microsoft get started? It's like every one of those companies and a bunch of others got started by people that were still in college. Okay. Now, that's not to say that every college startup is going to end up being a big company, because the vast majority of them will not. But the experience that they have of starting a company and discovering what works and what didn't is what's more important than saying the odds of success of a student starting a company that's going to be a serious company, that those odds are so low, it's not worth doing. Wrong attitude. All right. It's like, we want to give them that experience. Entrepreneurs learn by experience. And the sooner one begins that experience, the more likely they're going to be developing something in their next opportunity that will benefit from the mistakes they made. We learn much more from our mistakes than we do our successes. And if the university helped the student, I will also argue, and it's part of what I say in the book, where the university was supportive in the entrepreneur's journey of discovery, that entrepreneur will not forget the university. And it doesn't have to be with a tech transfer arrangement or anything else. They won't forget. And if you look at where the dollars come from for this universities that are most successful with contributions from their alumni, it's not with strings that are tied to tech transfer. It has come through that observation that students do not forget the universities that were helpful in shaping their journey.
Any additional audience questions, please feel free to chime in through the chat. How do you see business leaders in the community having an opportunity to engage with that greatest asset, as you described it.
Well, that means having what I call recurring events as opposed to one-shot deals. So if you do a once-a-year dinner, you're not really going to develop relationships. If you think of what we did with Start Fast and how that created a structure in which there was an ongoing amount of contact and a rhythm to it, it's events and activities that can be on a regular cycle that presents multiple shots on goal for relationships to begin, be it through creative collision and eventually through those relationships that get started by being in the right place at the right time. Eventually, you end up having that second source of how relationships really get made, and that's referral by trusted source. So when we've always held within Upstate Venture Connect, our goals are really twofold: to increase the volume and quality of both creative collisions and referral by trusted source. So if universities adopt just that philosophy of, all right, we want to grow more talent retention with students that are serious about being on an entrepreneurship path, the lens to look through is, how can we get more creative collisions and develop referral by trusted source by having mechanisms in which the right people can then be connected without necessarily having the university as a gatekeeper. That's the trick. And these are things we continue to experiment with, both in Upstate Venture Connect side and the More Good Jobs community. So you might say our building an online community with More Good Jobs, that's just another experiment. James, you're doing a lot to help move that along. We're still early in that journey, but we're starting to see some lessons that we're learning from having been at it almost a year now. And I remain optimistic that we're going to have some things come out of that. The beauty of that online arrangement is it can be geographically dispersed, and we're bringing people together that would never have the opportunity to run into each other in a meeting someplace, and yet can add value to relationships that can be material.
Yeah, it's and to put an exclamation point on your point about the recurring events, and I don't even know if I've told you this before, but the idea for this entrepreneur speaker series was in many ways to provide just that. And I look forward to the day we can do it again in person. COVID has kind of provided a hiccup for that, but ideally to kind of rally the community around that in person. And it was actually inspired by a similar event series we used to have in Syracuse called the Famous Entrepreneur Series. I don't know if you remember that, but it was through attending one of those probably over 10 years ago, at the James Commons at Lemoyne College, that I met Chuck Storman, who later became our partner at StartFest. So it's just, goes to show, firsthand how that sort of cycle happens. Who was an exited entrepreneur and trying to invest in the next generation. So anyway, thank you, Martin, for taking the time to do this. I really, really appreciate it. It's always a pleasure. And I always learn new things every time. So thank you very much for that.
Well, James, thanks for putting it all together and for MACNY being the sponsor and helping to get the word out. So, you're walking the talk, James, and I really appreciate that. And thanks for everybody turning out as well.
It's a passionate thing, I think, for all of us, and having kids grow up in the region, as I always say, that, I want them to grow up in that kind of vibrant community and not feel like they have to make a choice to leave. And so I think it's important work what you're doing to make that future for them. So thank you for that and everything.
All right.
Cool. Take care, everybody.
All right. Bye.
We'll see you. Have a good day.
You too.